mentioned, my name's Justine Dawson, and I'm in Santa Monica, Tongva Land, which is on the west side of LA, for those of you not familiar with LA. Though I'm originally from Canada, that's where I grew up. And I came to the States about 20 years ago to study Buddhist meditation. And I came with a lot of questions about finding a depth of ease inside of myself. I had a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, and deep questions. I guess at that point I was in my late 20s, and just the questions of life. And I got so much out of my meditation practice, but one thing that it left me with was a lot of questions about relationship. And I'll tell you more about that because the past many years, like I mentioned, about the past 15 years or really even more, have been a deep exploration of intimacy. During that time, I've been in relationships, some long, some short. And then 3 years ago, I moved to Los Angeles and had a big change in my life and the pandemic. And so here I am in LA, and I'm in the practice with you. I'm also single and dating. And so you can know that the things that you wrestle with are things I have wrestled with. And the practices I teach are practices that I still do. And so again, like I said before, this isn't theoretical, it's very experiential. There's nothing I teach that I don't practice myself. And so, you'll get to hear some about that. And, even actually as I was preparing for this class tonight, I was thinking back to some of my early meditation experiences and what they started to teach me, or at least show me about dating, relationship, intimacy. In particular, I was thinking about the first long retreat I sat. So this was actually a 3-month retreat, which means it's 3 months in silence, where you're not talking. Just a couple of times a week, you briefly check in with the teacher, but you're there in a retreat center with a good number of other people that you don't really, most of the time you don't know them, but you're sitting and walking over and over again all day long together in silence. And something that can happen on retreats, this length and even short ones, if any of you have even done a retreat that's a few days or a week, is something that's called a vipassana romance. Vipassana being the kind of meditation that we practice, insight meditation. And a vipassana romance is the experience of seeing someone across the meditation hall and falling in love with the idea of them. And this first 3-month retreat that I sat, I remember sitting in the meditation hall, and early in the retreat, there was this man across the meditation hall that caught my eye. And wow, so it was basically 3 months of getting to see how my mind operated when it came to someone else. I mean, if you think of when we open a dating app and we see a profile, or, we're out at a meditation group or in an art class or something, and someone catches our eye, and everything that we can project about ourselves and about them. Well, this is what I got to experience in the silence of sitting with my own mind in this retreat. So, I got to see what I created them to be, like what I projected onto this person, the kind of personality, the kind of what their voice would be like, what their presence would be like, how I imagined they would be relationally. I got to see how I could project in potential arguments that we would have, project from like, oh, this is what dating would be like. This is what it would be like if we got married. This is what our kids would be like. I mean, if you've ever sat retreat, your mind can really, what's called like proliferate. It picks up an idea and it will just run with it. And you can see it happening. Actually, the word for it is papancha. I love that word because it just means how our mind picks up on things and we'll start running with it. And when it comes to dating, like, wow, does our mind get papancha, right? It's like somebody does one thing or they look a certain way, and what are all the things we start thinking and feeling. And so for these 3 months, a big part of my retreat was watching my own mind around this whole internal drama about relationship. And of course, you can imagine, the retreat ends after 3 months, and it's like, oh my gosh, I finally get to meet this person, and so excited, and like wait for the right time to go meet them. And they open their mouth like nothing like I imagined that they would sound. We went for a walk, and it was like, oh, it was an okay, friendly connection, but nothing that special. Like, it was sweet, fellow meditator. But I got to see all of these ideas I'd fabricated crumble. And even all the hope, all the expectation suddenly was like, oh, wow, like I created all of that in my mind. And it was so educational for me because it really got to show me how I do that also in my life, and how I can see someone or even be in early stages of connecting, and where I can perceive things about myself or another that are not necessarily true, where I could lose myself, where I could build a fantasy. And so it really set me on this course of really wanting to understand how to do things differently. Not only that, but like to not be just in the silence and seclusion of retreat, which in some ways actually felt really safe, but then being able to be out in the world and to engage with intimacy where, there it was vulnerable, I'd be exposed. I didn't feel the safety of the silence and the solitude, which, as challenging as it is, in some ways was a lot easier for me. So anyway, you can imagine there's been many years of dating and experience and learning since then. And ultimately, what I have come to find is that dating is an experience just like any aspect of relating, whether it's friendship, partnership, romance, sexual partner, whatever your kind of intimacy is that it's an experience of growth, whether we want it or not. And if we can actually take it on as an experience of growth and do it consciously, there's so much that's available to us. So, we might think of relationship and dating. Let's take dating, specifically as like, oh, I'm going in because I want to get something. Like, I'm going to date because, let's say, most commonly it would be I'm looking for a partner. It might be I'm dating for friendship, because someone mentioned friendship, and actually there, I think more and more that there's like, we can date, quote unquote, for friendship. There could be a kind of dating for sexual partners. There can be dating inside marriage. But we could see how we can often have a goal in dating, like I'm trying to get something. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's ultimately desire, right? We have desire for something that's motivating us. And so I invite people, and I invite you to think of what you desire, and we're going to talk more about that, and hold it in one hand. And then in the other hand, hold what you want to grow in yourself or, in relationship. So there's kind of the getting, the desiring, the wanting something, and then there's the growing something. So just like when we have our meditation practice, we might meditate because we want to be more awake, we want more peace in our lives, we want more presence. And then we also are cultivating in the present moment, and a growth inside of ourselves. So dating is this exploration in both. And there's a few ingredients, especially that I see are helpful for that. The first one is attention. So how do we bring our attention to this playground of dating? And actually, maybe before I really go in here, what I should say is that when we take on dating as a process, a practice of growth, we can see it in a way, the way I would describe it, as research. So, you think of research being like a scientific term, right? Like you're in a lab and you're researching. Well, research can be equally applied to your relational life. So, for instance, when I left that retreat, it was like, oh, I want to research actually really being able to see someone and know them without falling into some kind of fantasy. Like, I really want to research being able to cultivate my attention so I can really get to know people before leaping to any conclusions. You can think in some ways that kind of research is just mindfulness practice. We put our attention on something with curiosity and it reveals itself to us. So dating can become that experience, an experience of research. And I'll say a little more about the different ways that we can research in a minute. But really you could start thinking about that way, like, okay, so if dating is not just about getting something, like finding a partner that checks all the boxes, but is about growing in some way, and that I do that through research, through taking on opportunities to explore, like, how does that change my dating life? So, I think of different people that I've worked with over the years myself, and also a lot of students and clients of work that I do one-on-one with people. And what we come back to over and over again is, what do you want to learn about yourself? And what do you want to learn about intimacy? So, for instance, it might start with like, oh, I want to get out of social isolation. Certainly after COVID, that was true for a lot of people. Like, oh, I've just been in either I want to break through my social anxiety, or I want to break out of social isolation. And just actually getting out on a date is a big thing. In some ways, it doesn't matter with who or what exactly happens, but just that courageous act is big. So that's something I want to research. But there might be also something like, I want to research being open-hearted and actually letting people in a little more. Like, I've been very guarded and I want to learn how to do that. Or someone mentioned earlier, I want to research how to stay rooted in myself while in connection with another. These are all things that I've seen with people that I've worked with. Or I want to research not settling for just anything. Like, kind of I get into relationship because somebody wants me, but I want to actually research really staying true to what I truly want. So even, as you kind of hear these, each of these things, you can think of like, oh, you set your intention for what you intend to explore, and then that can help guide your experience. Sometimes the research can be, I want to research exploring my own sexuality and eroticism. I think this can be true for all genders. I've especially seen it for people who identify as women. Like, I have never actually just owned my own sexuality and my own desires. And what would it be like to be able to just go out and explore that for myself, to know what's inside of me and what's possible for me? So, as I'm talking about this, you could start thinking like, what are the things that I'm wanting to learn or I'm curious about in relationship and in intimacy? So there's the things about other people, and often when we start dating, I think about like, we have our checklist. I want them to be this, I want them to be that, I want them to like these things, I like us to have our common interests. It's helpful in a basic way. But in this class, what I want to invite you into is to think more about, what do I want to learn about myself? And what do I want to learn about intimacy? What do I want to learn to do when I'm in connection with another? So, like I mentioned with the Vipassana romance, I got to see all of the ways that, I was programmed, I was conditioned, things around wanting to feel desired or wanting to feel saved and swept away, or, wanting to have my mind read. Like, I can, these are things I've seen in myself and I've seen in a lot of other people. Wanting sex, wanting to win, wanting to be the one that's chosen, wanting to be the one that wins a person above others. And so we can see all of these patterns that we might have that lead us down rabbit holes that are not the rabbit holes we want to go into. And you probably have a good sense of yours. right? So that's part of dating, is it brings this up. And I want to say that's not bad. Like the fact that I had that whole Vipassana romance, the fact that I've dated, I've been in relationships where it's like, oh my gosh, what got reflected back to me about, my habits and what motivates me. It's all fuel for my learning. And so I really want to invite you, like if there's been shame about what's happened for you in dating and relationship, to turn towards it and actually notice what it's taught you about yourself, so that you can then actually grow from it and learn in a new way. There's nobody I've met who hasn't had these things that they've had to work with. And just going into the dating realm, going into intimacy, like I mentioned, oh my gosh, how much I wished, in my early days of doing a lot of retreat practice, I really thought about being a nun. I was doing these long retreats for months at a time. And there was that Vipassana romance situation, but there's a lot of times on retreats where it's like, this is so easy. It's just myself and walking and sitting. And of course I'm with my mind, but oh my God, are people way more complicated? All of those questions of intimacy, so much more complex. And so, actually, wow, like having to turn towards them and take them on as a practice has been really, really powerful. That's why I'm teaching this stuff now, because back then it just felt like maybe I just want to be a nun instead. Facing all of this stuff is really challenging. And going into meeting people, friendships, dating, relating is bringing it all up. And so if you notice that as you go through this class, that it's like, patterns, you're relating patterns, all of this, even as you start working on some of the dating stuff or exploring it, it's noticing, like, include that all. Like all of those triggers, all of the stuff that comes up, it's great. It's fuel for the exploration. It's showing you things that you can research. You're somebody who gets really lost in another person. Great. You really can research, how do I stay rooted in myself? You come back to it over and over again. And with that, ultimately, I see is that you're researching how to become the person who can have the relationship you want, right? Like we all want certain kinds of relationship or relationships. And who do we need to become to have that? And this is not, I know someone mentioned like go off and work on it in isolation and then maybe it will magically come into your life. I will honestly say I have a different view on that we are interconnected beings. Sometimes it's useful to take a pause from romantic or intimate relating, but ultimately we learn so much through connection. And so yeah, this is not about going off and trying to perfect yourself. It's like, oh, I'll work on this. I'll be so perfect and I'll be able to come and then I'll just be able to have the relationship. But relating brings up what we can learn, what we can practice. We can go on dates and it's like, oh, do I have the capacity to communicate vulnerably? Do I have the capacity to express my desires honestly? Do I have the capacity to notice another person deeply and honestly without projection? Do I have the capacity to set boundaries? Do I have the capacity to be mindful, like be present in my own body and not leave myself? I have a client that recently I was working with, and he was really desiring as he was dating to bring mindfulness into his sexuality. Like, okay, so now I'm dating someone new. I'm so excited for the first time we have sex. I really want to bring this mindfulness to it. So, we were talking about like he really had this big desire. And what we ended up exploring was, well, how do you start doing that with yourself? Like right now in your own life, how can you be sexually mindful with yourself, masturbating, touching yourself, how you are with yourself? If you can't do it there, how are you going to be able to do it when there's another person and even more energy and anticipation and anxiety? So, we can start practicing whatever date we're on, wherever we are in the dating process, we can start practicing how to be the person, how to become the person, becoming the person that can have the relationship that we want. becoming the person who can do all of these things. So that all said, actually, I'm going to briefly mention the ingredients. I'd started talking about that before. There's a few ingredients that are really helpful in this process. So again, just recapping, if the process is simply recognizing where we're at, taking on dating as both having desires and goals, but also being in process, having it be a research experience, a learning experience, getting to explore cultivating aspects of ourselves. What are some ingredients? What are some mindful ingredients that help us do that? So the first one I would say is curiosity. Having curiosity for the process, curiosity for ourselves, curiosity for the other person, to go in with that kind of like, oh, what could I learn here? What's this other person about? What's coming up for me? You know, that kind of that interest in the process. So curiosity, which really fuels attention, really using it as a practice of attention. And we'll talk about ways to do this, about being able to go into a date with attention, being able to reflect on it with attention. What do we notice about it? What do we notice about ourselves or another person? And ultimately, you know, attention is the fuel for connection. It's like our ability to be able to really notice another, tune into them, tune into the space between us is what creates intimacy. So curiosity, attention. And then the third one is play. If we can really remember to bring play, like that sometimes dating can become so serious and heavy, and it's like, oh my God, I'm back on the apps. I got to spend my hour of my free time going through this. It's such a labor. And what does it look like to bring some play into it? Again, we'll talk more about these in depth, but those are the three key ones: attention, curiosity, and play. And we'll talk about how to do this within the range that's right for you. Like, what does it look like to create a research that's right for you? So in fact, actually, what I want to do in a moment is I want to invite us to go into small groups and to explore a little together. We'll be about groups of 3, is what might you research about dating? If there's something that you really want to learn about yourself, or you really want to explore through your dating process, what are some potential kind of areas of research? So again, like I mentioned, it might be I want to research going on dates and really staying present in my body and my own self-awareness as I'm with another person. Or it might be, I really want to explore the erotic, and I want to explore sexuality. I want to explore what it's like to go out and meet different people and have different experiences. It might be, I want to practice being really honest, because I start going out and I start, you know, saying things and talking about things and agreeing to things that aren't actually true to me. It's really hard for me to actually just stay honest in the whole process. So maybe that's a research. So you could think of like, as I go through this process of dating, what are some things that I'd like to research?